Anna Anderson and the Romanov fortune. In 1920, a young woman was found in Berlin suffering from severe injuries and disorientation. She refused to identify herself, and for 2 years, she remained in a psychiatric hospital as Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown. Then she made a claim that would captivate the world for decades. She was Grand Duchess Anastasia Romanova, the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and she had survived the Bolshevik execution of the imperial family in 1918. The woman, who would become known as Anna Anderson, claimed that she had been wounded but not killed during the execution at Yekaterinburg. She said she was smuggled out of Russia by a sympathetic guard and eventually made her way to Berlin. When she learned that substantial Romanov fortune, worth millions, was deposited in foreign banks, she began her quest to claim it. What made Anna Anderson's case extraordinary was her knowledge of intimate Romanov family details. She could describe the layout of the palaces, recount childhood memories with remarkable specificity, and identify family photographs correctly. She knew about private family jokes, nicknames, and incidents that weren't in any public record. Several members of the extended Romanov family met with her. Some were convinced she was genuinely Anastasia. Tatiana Botkin, whose father had been the imperial family's physician and was killed with them, became one of Anna's strongest supporters after meeting her. She recognized mannerisms and speech patterns that seemed authentic. Anderson knew intimate details about the family that seemed impossible for an imposter to know. She could identify people in photographs who weren't labeled. She recounted conversations and events that had never been publicly documented. Her supporters argued that only Anastasia herself could possess such knowledge. However, other Romanov relatives denounced her as a fraud. Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig of Hesse, Anastasia's uncle, hired private investigators who claimed to prove she was actually a Polish factory worker named Franziska Szankowska, who had gone missing around the same time Anderson appeared in Berlin. The legal battle over the Romanov inheritance lasted decades. Anderson filed lawsuits in German courts attempting to be legally recognized as Anastasia Romanova. The case dragged through the courts from 1938 to 1970, becoming one of the longest-running legal battles in German history. Ultimately, the courts ruled they could not definitively prove she was Anastasia, but they also couldn't definitively prove she wasn't. Anna Anderson died in 1984, still maintaining she was Anastasia. DNA testing in the 1990s, after her death, compared her DNA with that of living Romanov relatives. The results showed she was not related to the Romanovs, seemingly confirming she was an imposter. But the mystery deepened when researchers discovered that Anderson's DNA matched that of Franziska Szankowska's living relatives, apparently proving the investigators' claims from decades earlier. Yet, this raised a troubling question. If she was Franziska Szankowska, how did she know intimate Romanov family details that weren't published anywhere? Some researchers have suggested she was coached by someone with insider knowledge, perhaps a former palace servant or a Romanov family member who believed helping an imposter claim the fortune was better than letting the Soviet government or distant relatives take it. Others believe she may have had access to unpublished diaries or correspondence, but no evidence of such coaching or documents was ever found. Anna Anderson's knowledge of the Romanov family remained one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Whether through extraordinary research, insider information, or something else entirely, she knew things that a Polish factory worker with no connection to the imperial family shouldn't have been able to know. The Tichborne Claimant. In 1854, Roger Tichborne, heir to one of England's wealthiest estates, was traveling by ship from South America to the West Indies when his vessel disappeared at sea. He was declared dead, and his mother, Henriette Félicité, refused to believe her son had perished. For years, she advertised in newspapers worldwide, searching for any trace of him. In 1866, a man appeared in Australia claiming to be Roger Tichborne. He contacted the family's solicitors and eventually made his way to England to claim the Tichborne fortune, an estate worth approximately $1,000 per year, equivalent to millions today, and extensive landholdings in Hampshire. The claimant looked nothing like Roger Tichborne. Roger had been slim and refined, weighing about 140 pounds. The claimant was a heavy-set butcher from Wagga Wagga, Australia, weighing over 300 pounds. He couldn't speak French, which Roger had spoken fluently. His manners were crude, and he appeared uneducated. Yet Lady Tichborne, Roger's mother, accepted him immediately as her son. She welcomed him back and supported his claim to the estate. More remarkably, the claimant knew intimate details about the Tichborne family that seemed impossible for a stranger to know. He could describe the layout of Tichborne House in detail, including rooms that weren't accessible to servants or casual visitors. He knew about private family conversations and events. He could identify family members in photographs and recall incidents from Roger's childhood. He knew about a secret engagement Roger had been in before his voyage, something known only to close family members. His supporters included several former Tichborne servants who swore he was genuinely Roger. They recognized mannerisms, ways of speaking, and personal habits. Some testified they recognized scars and physical marks on his body that matched Roger's. When Lady Tichborne died in 1868, the claimant proceeded with his legal case to claim the estate. The trial became a sensation, lasting 102 days and becoming one of the longest and most expensive trials in English legal history. Over 100 witnesses testified, split between those who believed he was Roger and those certain he was an imposter. The prosecution presented evidence that the claimant was actually Arthur Orton, a butcher's son from Wapping, London, who had emigrated to Australia. Witnesses from Wapping testified they recognized him. His physical appearance, crude manners, and lack of education seemed to support this identification. The defense argued that Roger's years abroad, illness, trauma from the shipwreck, and lifestyle changes could explain his altered appearance and loss of refinement. They pointed to his detailed knowledge of the Tichborne family as proof that no impostor could possess such information. In 1872, the jury ruled against the claimant after just 30 minutes of deliberation. He was subsequently tried for perjury, convicted, and sentenced to 14 years in prison. During the criminal trial, more evidence emerged suggesting he was Arthur Orton, including testimony from Orton's family members. Yet to his death in 1898, the claimant maintained he was Roger Tichborne, and the central mystery was never satisfactorily explained. How did he know so many intimate details about the Tichborne family? The prosecution suggested he was coached by someone with insider knowledge, but no such person was ever identified. Some theorized that disgruntled servants or distant relatives fed him information, hoping to benefit from his success. But the specificity and breadth of his knowledge seemed beyond what any amount of coaching could provide. He knew not just facts, but family dynamics, personalities, private jokes, the kind of knowledge that comes from living in a family, not studying it from the outside. Some historians have argued that, while he was probably Arthur Orton, he might also have had some connection to Roger Tichborne. Perhaps he met the real Roger in Australia after the shipwreck, learned his story, and decided to assume his identity. But no evidence of such a meeting was ever found. The Canavan Inheritance. In 1932, wealthy Australian grazier Patrick Canavan died, leaving an estate worth approximately $50,000, a fortune equivalent to several $1 million today. He had been estranged from his family for years and left no will. Under inheritance law, his estate would go to his closest living relatives. A woman named Mary Canavan came forward claiming to be his daughter, produced what appeared to be a birth certificate, and presented testimony from witnesses who claimed to remember her birth. She provided intimate details about Patrick Canavan's life, including information about his properties, business dealings, and personal habits. The problem, Patrick Canavan's legitimate family insisted he'd never had a daughter. His siblings and their children had clear documentation of the family tree, and Mary Canavan didn't appear in it. They hired investigators who claimed to prove that Mary was actually Mary Bridget O'Connor, born to a completely different family with no connection to the Canavans. Yet Mary knew things about Patrick Canavan that weren't in any public record. She could describe the interiors of his properties, including a station house where she claimed to have lived as a child. She knew about business transactions he'd made decades earlier. She recounted conversations and personal details that seemed authentic. Most remarkably, she produced letters that appeared to be from Patrick Canavan to her mother, discussing their daughter and making references to family matters. Handwriting experts who examined the letters were divided. Some said they were genuine. Others claimed they were sophisticated forgeries. The case went to court in 1934. The trial revealed complex questions about identity and evidence. Mary presented witnesses who testified they remembered her as a child in the Canavan household. Patrick's family presented equally credible witnesses who testified that no such child had ever existed. The judge faced an impossible situation. Two contradictory narratives, both supported by apparently credible evidence. How could an impostor know such intimate details? But how could a real daughter have been completely unknown to the rest of the family? The court ultimately ruled against Mary Canavan, finding that the weight of evidence suggested she was not Patrick's daughter. But the ruling was close, and the judge acknowledged that aspects of her claim remained unexplained. Years later, researchers examining the case discovered something intriguing. Patrick Canavan had spent several years in Queensland during a period where his movements were poorly documented. It's possible he had a relationship there that produced a child his family never knew about. This would explain Mary's knowledge of Patrick and his properties. She might have been telling the truth, or at least part of it. She might have been his daughter from a secret relationship, though perhaps not by the mother she claimed. The letters could have been real, but misattributed, or she might have been an extraordinary fraudster who somehow gained access to information about Patrick Canavan's private life. But the source of that information was never identified, and the mystery of how she knew what she knew remains unsolved. The disappeared heir of Whitehall. In 1956, British industrialist Lord Edward Whitehall died, leaving an estate valued at over $2 million. His only son, James Whitehall, had disappeared in 1944 during World War II. James had been an RAF pilot whose plane was shot down over France. His body was never recovered, but after the war, he was officially declared dead. In 1957, a man appeared at the Whitehall family solicitor's office in London, claiming to be James Whitehall. He explained that he had survived the crash, was captured by the Germans, escaped, and spent years in Europe suffering from amnesia. He said his memory had finally returned, and he'd come home to claim his inheritance. The family was skeptical. The claimant was the right age, but his appearance had changed. He was heavier, his hair had gone gray, and he had a scar on his face he attributed to the crash. He spoke English with a slight accent, which he explained was the result of years speaking French and German. What shocked the family was his knowledge. He knew intimate details of the Whitehall household, the names of servants, the layout of rooms in the family mansion, private family matters that had never been documented. He could describe his childhood bedroom in perfect detail. He knew about a secret hideout he and his brother had built in the woods on the estate. Most remarkably, he knew about a family scandal that had been carefully concealed. In 1938, James's younger sister had become pregnant out of wedlock. The family had quietly sent her abroad, and the child was given up for adoption. This scandal had been kept so secret that only immediate family members knew about it. Yet the claimant not only knew about it, but could describe conversations and details surrounding the incident. The family conducted extensive investigations. They interviewed people who had known James before the war. The reactions were mixed. Some were convinced this was genuinely James Whitehall, while others were certain he was an impostor. The claimant submitted to fingerprint analysis. Unfortunately, James Whitehall's fingerprints from before the war couldn't be located. They had been in military records that were destroyed during a fire in 1945. Without definitive physical evidence, the case came down to knowledge and memory. The family solicitors conducted extensive interviews, asking detailed questions about James's life. The claimant answered correctly far more often than chance would allow. He knew about family investments, property details, and personal relationships that weren't documented anywhere. In 1959, after 2 years of investigation and legal proceedings, the courts ruled in the claimant's favor. He was legally recognized as James Whitehall and awarded the inheritance. The family, though some remained skeptical, accepted the ruling, but questions lingered. Questions. If he was an imposter, how did he know about the family scandal? The only people who knew about it were direct family members, and all of them insisted they had told no one. Had someone in the family secretly coached him, hoping to gain influence over the fortune? No evidence of such a conspiracy was ever found. Or was he genuinely James Whitehall, having survived against the odds and returned after more than a decade? His knowledge seemed to support this, yet something about him seemed different, not just physically, but in personality and manner. In 1973, the man died. His obituary listed him as James Whitehall, heir to the Whitehall fortune. To this day, historians debate whether justice was served or whether one of Britain's greatest inheritances was claimed by an impostor with inexplicable knowledge. The Dupont twins mystery. In 1963, French industrialist Marcel Dupont died in a car accident, leaving an estate worth approximately 50 million francs. He had a son, Philippe, who was his sole heir. Philippe was a reclusive man who rarely left his apartment in Paris and had few friends or social contacts. 6 months after Marcel's death, two men appeared separately to claim the Dupont inheritance. Both claimed to be Philippe Dupont. Both had identification documents. Both knew intimate details about the Dupont family, and most incredibly, both were physically identical. The first claimant, whom we'll call Philippe A., appeared at the family solicitor's office with a passport, birth certificate, and bank records. He knew about family investments, could describe the layout of Marcel's various properties, and could recount childhood memories in convincing detail. 2 weeks later, Philippe B. appeared with equally convincing documentation and equally detailed knowledge. When investigators compared photographs, they discovered something impossible. The two men appeared to be identical twins, but Marcel Dupont had only one son. There was no record of twins. Hospital records from Philippe's birth showed a single child. Marcel's wife had died when Philippe was young, and there was no one who could explain how two identical men could both be Philippe. The case became a sensation in French media. Investigators examined both men's documentation. Both sets appeared genuine, not forgeries. Handwriting analysis of signatures on various documents showed both men had been signing as Philippe Dupont for years, with records going back decades. Both men knew things only Philippe should know. Philippe A. could describe his father's office in detail, including the location of a hidden safe that only Marcel and Philippe knew about. Philippe B. knew about a summer house in Provence that wasn't listed in any public records, a private retreat where Marcel and Philippe had spent time together. Most bizarrely, both men had memories of the same events, but from slightly different perspectives. They both remembered the same family vacation to Switzerland in 1952, but with different details about what happened. They both recalled the same Christmas dinner in 1960, but disagreed about who had been present. Investigators considered multiple theories. Were they actually twins separated at birth, with one given up for adoption? But why would hospital records show only one child? Had one of the Philippes died and been replaced by a look-alike at some point? But which one was the imposter, and how did they acquire such detailed knowledge? The case went to court in 1965. The proceedings were bizarre. Both men presented compelling evidence of their identity. Both had witnesses who testified they'd known them as Philippe for years. Both could answer detailed questions about the Dupont family correctly. DNA testing didn't exist in 1965, so definitive biological proof was impossible. The court faced an unprecedented situation. Two apparently identical men with equal claims to an identity and a fortune. After months of testimony and investigation, the court made an unusual ruling. They declared that one of the men was definitely the real Philippe Dupont, but they couldn't determine which one. They ordered the estate to be divided equally between them until definitive proof could be established. Both men accepted the ruling and disappeared from public view. One moved to Monaco, the other to Switzerland. They never met each other, and both lived quietly on their portions of the inheritance. In 1989, one of the men died. The other attended the funeral, which was private and closed to media. What, if anything, was said between them at that meeting is unknown. The survivor died in 2003. In his will, he left a sealed letter to be opened after his death. When opened, the letter contained a single sentence: "We were both right and both wrong." No further explanation was provided. To this day, no one knows who the two men really were, how they could be identical, or how both possessed intimate knowledge of Philippe Dupont's life. The mystery of the Dupont twins remains one of the strangest inheritance cases in French legal history. The Ivanov Identity. In 1978, Soviet businessman Dmitry Ivanov died in Moscow, leaving a substantial estate including properties, cash, and valuable assets. His son, Alexei Ivanov, was living in Leningrad and was named as the sole heir. But before Alexei could claim the inheritance, A man appeared in Moscow claiming to be Alexei Ivanov. Soviet authorities were immediately suspicious. The claimant looked somewhat like Alexei, but wasn't identical. He spoke Russian with a slight accent, and most suspiciously he appeared to know nothing about his supposed life in Leningrad. He couldn't describe his apartment, didn't know his neighbors, and couldn't answer questions about his recent activities. However, the claimant knew everything about Alexei's childhood, his father Dmitry, and the Ivanov family history. He could describe the family's dacha in detail, including modifications Dmitry had made that weren't documented anywhere. He knew about family members who had died years ago. He could recount conversations and incidents from Alexei's youth with remarkable accuracy. When authorities contacted the real Alexei Ivanov in Leningrad, he was shocked to learn someone was impersonating him. He traveled to Moscow to confront the imposter. The meeting was witnessed by Soviet officials and became the subject of a classified KGB report. When the two men met, something strange happened. The real Alexei became visibly shaken. He told investigators that the imposter had told him things that only Alexei should know, intimate details about Alexei's life that had never been shared with anyone. Most disturbing was a specific incident the imposter described. In 1965, when Alexei was 14 years old, he had been involved in an accident that he'd never told anyone about, not even his father. The imposter described the accident in perfect detail, what happened, where it occurred, what Alexei had been thinking and feeling at the time. When investigators asked the real Alexei if this was accurate, he confirmed it was, but insisted he'd never told anyone. The imposter couldn't possibly know. The case was referred to KGB psychologists who interviewed both men extensively. Their report, declassified in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed, revealed something bizarre. The imposter appeared to genuinely believe he was Alexei Ivanov. He wasn't lying or trying to deceive. He truly thought he was claiming his own inheritance. The real Alexei, meanwhile, became increasingly disturbed by the imposter's knowledge. He told investigators that speaking with the imposter felt like talking to a version of myself from another life. The case was quietly resolved when the imposter was determined to be suffering from a psychiatric condition and was institutionalized. The real Alexei claimed his inheritance. But the KGB investigation was never able to determine how the imposter had acquired such detailed, intimate knowledge of Alexei's life and memories. One KGB theory, mentioned in the declassified files, suggested the imposter might have been part of an experimental program involving memory transfer or psychological profiling techniques. The Soviet Union had conducted various psychological and parapsychological research programs during this period. Some focused on interrogation techniques and information extraction, but no evidence linking the imposter to any such program was found. The official conclusion was that the case remained unexplained, an imposter with impossible knowledge, claiming an identity that wasn't his, yet knowing things about that identity that no one else knew. The Mackenzie Reappearance. In 1947, Scottish landowner Donald Mackenzie died, leaving his estate to his nephew Thomas Mackenzie, who had been missing since 1945. Thomas had been a soldier in World War II and had disappeared during the final days of the war in Germany. He was presumed dead, and probate proceedings were underway to distribute the estate among distant relatives. In 1948, a man appeared at the Mackenzie estate claiming to be Thomas Mackenzie. He explained that he'd been captured by the Germans in the final weeks of the war, held in a POW camp that hadn't been properly documented, and then spent time recovering from injuries in a German hospital before making his way back to Britain. The family was skeptical. Thomas had been missing for 3 years with no word, no records, nothing. The claimant looked like Thomas might look after years of hardship, but he was thinner, more haggard, and seemed different in manner. But he knew things. He could describe the Mackenzie estate in detail, not just the main house, but outbuildings, specific rooms, even the contents of drawers and closets. He knew about family traditions, private jokes, and personal habits of various family members. Most convincingly, he knew about a buried treasure. As a child, Thomas had buried a box containing childhood treasures in a specific location on the estate, something he'd never told anyone about. The claimant knew exactly where it was. When they dug at the location he specified, they found the box, still containing the items the real Thomas had buried decades earlier. The family began to accept him. How could an imposter know about the buried box? It had been Thomas's private childhood secret. If this man knew about it, surely he must be Thomas. The claimant moved into the estate and began managing the properties. For several months, everything seemed normal. Then a visitor arrived, a man who had served in the same regiment as Thomas during the war. When the visitor met the claimant, he immediately declared him to be an imposter. The visitor's name was James Crawford, and he insisted that Thomas Mackenzie had been seriously wounded in Germany in 1945 and had not survived. Crawford claimed he'd been with Thomas at the end. The claimant denied this, saying Crawford must be mistaken or confused. But Crawford was adamant. He provided details about what happened to Thomas, where it occurred, the circumstances, specific injuries Thomas had sustained. The case went to court. Crawford testified under oath about Thomas's fate. The claimant maintained he was genuinely Thomas, and that Crawford was either mistaken or part of a conspiracy to steal the inheritance. The court faced a dilemma. If Crawford was telling the truth, how did the claimant know about the buried treasure? If the claimant was the real Thomas, why would Crawford be so certain about what happened? The investigation revealed something intriguing. In Thomas's military records, there was a note about a close friend he'd made during the war, a German prisoner who had been in the same POW camp before Thomas disappeared. The German prisoner's name was Klaus Müller, and he had also disappeared at the end of the war. Investigators tracked down Müller's family in Germany. They learned that Klaus Müller had been fluent in English and had spent months in the same camp as Thomas Mackenzie, where they had become friends and shared many conversations about their lives and families. The theory emerged that perhaps Klaus Müller had assumed Thomas Mackenzie's identity after the war, using knowledge he'd gained from their friendship. But this theory had a massive problem. How did Müller know about the buried treasure? That was a childhood secret from before the war, from before Müller ever met Thomas. Even if Thomas had mentioned the treasure to Müller during their time as prisoners, which seemed unlikely for such a personal childhood memory, how would Müller have convinced Thomas to describe its exact location in precise detail? The court ultimately ruled against the claimant, largely based on Crawford's testimony and the lack of definitive physical proof. The claimant was asked to leave Britain, though it was never definitively proven he was Klaus Müller. No fingerprints or photographs of Müller from before the war could be located for comparison. The claimant, whoever he was, left Britain and disappeared. Years later, researchers discovered that a man matching his description had been living in Argentina under yet another name. When approached, he refused to discuss the Mackenzie case. The mystery of how he knew about the buried treasure was never solved. Even if he was Klaus Müller and Thomas had told him about it, the level of detail required to find it so easily on such a large estate suggests either an incredibly specific conversation or something more inexplicable. The Caldwell fortune claim. In 1982, American industrialist Robert Caldwell died, leaving an estate worth approximately $50 million. He'd been a reclusive man with no close family. His will left everything to a trust for charity, with provisions that if any legitimate heir came forward within 5 years, they would inherit instead. In 1985, a woman named Margaret Caldwell appeared claiming to be Robert's daughter. She said she'd been born out of wedlock in 1951, that Robert had supported her mother financially but hadn't acknowledged her publicly, and that she'd learned about his death and the inheritance through newspaper articles. The executors of the estate were skeptical. They asked for proof. Margaret provided a birth certificate listing Robert Caldwell as her father. She provided letters that appeared to be from Robert to her mother, discussing their daughter. She provided financial records showing regular payments from Robert to her mother over many years. All of this was impressive, but it could potentially be forged. What shocked the executors was Margaret's personal knowledge of Robert Caldwell. She could describe his homes, his habits, his personality. She told stories about visiting him as a child, secret visits her mother arranged. She knew about Robert's business dealings in remarkable detail. She could describe his office, his associates, his investment strategies. She knew personal details, that he collected antique pocket watches, that he had a fear of heights, that he preferred a specific brand of cigars. Investigators hired by the estate tried to disprove her claims. They found that her birth certificate appeared authentic. The letters passed handwriting analysis. The financial records checked out, regular payments from Robert Caldwell to Margaret's mother from 1951 to 1976. But they also found something troubling. Margaret's background didn't quite add up. There were gaps in her employment history. She'd lived in several different states under slightly different names. Some of her identity documents seemed to have been issued more recently than they should have been. When investigators interviewed people who'd known Robert Caldwell, none could confirm he'd had a daughter. His business associates, his staff, people who'd worked closely with him for decades, none had any knowledge of Margaret, yet her knowledge of him was undeniable. She could answer obscure questions about his business history correctly. She knew about failed investments and successful deals that weren't public knowledge. She could describe the interior of his vacation home in Maine, a property he rarely mentioned and almost never had visitors at. The case went to litigation in 1986. During depositions, Margaret provided even more specific knowledge. She described conversations she claimed to have had with her father during secret meetings. She recounted advice he'd given her. She knew about his fears, his regrets, his hopes. Some of what she said could be verified through Robert's private journals, which had been sealed and weren't accessible to the public. The executors checked her statements against the journals and found they matched. She was describing thoughts and feelings Robert had written about, but never shared with anyone. The estate's lawyers argued she must have gained access to the journals somehow, though there was no evidence of this. They suggested she might have had help from someone inside the trust, though no evidence of conspiracy was found. In 1987, the court ruled in Margaret's favor. She was recognized as Robert Caldwell's daughter and awarded the inheritance. The decision was controversial, with many believing she was a sophisticated con artist who'd somehow gained access to detailed information about Robert's life. Margaret Caldwell took the inheritance and largely disappeared from public view. She donated significant portions to charity and lived quietly. She never gave interviews about the case. In 2019, after Margaret died, her estate released a memoir she'd written, but kept private during her life. In it, she maintained she was genuinely Robert Caldwell's daughter. She explained that her mother had kept detailed diaries about Robert, which Margaret had used to learn about him after her mother's death. This explains some of her knowledge, but it didn't explain how she knew things that weren't in any diary. Intimate details of Robert's inner life, his business dealings, his private thoughts. Either she had access to sources beyond the diaries, or she was genuinely his daughter and had learned these things from him directly. The truth of whether Margaret Caldwell was a legitimate heir or a brilliant imposter died with her. Her memoir raised as many questions as it answered, and the case remains one of the most debated inheritance claims in American legal history. The Dubois Stranger. In 1971, French textile magnate Henri Dubois died, leaving an estate valued at over 100 million francs. He had no children and no close living relatives. His will left everything to distant cousins and various charities. But during the probate process, a man appeared claiming to be Henri's illegitimate son. The claimant, who called himself Jean Dubois, presented a compelling story. He said his mother had been Henri's secretary in the 1940s, that they'd had an affair, and that Jean was the result. His mother had kept the secret, raising Jean alone, and only told him about his father on her deathbed shortly after Henri's death. Jean had no documentation, no birth certificate listing Henri as his father, no letters, no proof. But he had something else, knowledge. He knew things about Henri Dubois that weren't in any public record. He could describe Henri's private art collection in detail, including pieces that weren't cataloged or publicly known. He knew about Henri's business practices, his negotiating strategies, his relationships with various business partners. He knew personal information, Henri's favorite foods, his preferred brands of clothing, his daily routines. Most remarkably, Jean knew about a secret relationship Henri had in the 1930s with a married woman. This affair had been carefully concealed to protect the woman's reputation. Only a few people had known about it, and all of them were deceased. Yet, Jean could describe where they met, what they talked about, details of the relationship that matched what investigators were able to verify through old correspondence they found in Henri's private papers. The estate's lawyers were baffled. If Jean was simply an imposter looking to claim a fortune, how did he know about the 1930s affair? Henri had been extremely discreet. There were no records of it beyond a few cryptic references in private letters that Jean couldn't have accessed. Jean explained that his mother had told him that Henri had confided in her about his past, including this old relationship. But investigators found no evidence that Jean's mother had ever worked for Henri or even known him. They couldn't find employment records, couldn't find anyone who remembered her working there. Jean's backstory began to unravel. The address where he claimed to have grown up didn't match his mother's known residences. His employment history had gaps. Some of his identity documents showed irregularities. Yet his knowledge of Henri Dubois remained unexplainable. During court proceedings, lawyers would spontaneously ask him questions about Henri's life, random details that no one could have researched. Jean answered correctly far more often than chance would allow. He knew about business deals Henri had been involved in decades ago. He could describe properties Henri had owned. He knew about Henri's health issues, including a medical condition Henri had kept private and that only his doctors knew about. The case became known in France as l'affaire de connaissance impossible, the case of impossible knowledge. Legal experts and psychologists studied Jean, trying to determine if he was suffering from delusions, if he'd been coached by someone with insider information, or if there was some other explanation. In 1974, the court ruled against Jean, determining that, without any documentation proving his relationship to Henri, the case relied solely on his knowledge, which, while impressive, could theoretically be explained by extensive research or inside information from an unknown source. Jean accepted the ruling and disappeared. Investigators tried to track him, but he seemed to vanish. His apartment was abandoned, his bank accounts emptied. In 1998, a lawyer working on a completely unrelated case stumbled across something interesting. While researching Henri Dubois' business history, he found references to a young man who had worked briefly for Henri in the early 1960s, a young man whose description matched Jean Dubois. This young man had been involved in a business dispute and had been quietly let go. Henri had paid him a substantial sum to leave and never return, apparently to avoid publicity. The young man's name in the records was partially obscured by damage to the documents, but what remained could be J.N. If this was the same person, it might explain his knowledge. He'd actually worked for Henri, spent time around him, learned about his life firsthand. But the timing was problematic. Jane had claimed to be born in the late 1940s, which would make him barely a teenager in the early 1960s. The young man in the records was described as in his 20s. Either Jean had lied about his age, or the young man in the records was someone else, or something more complicated was going on. The discovery raised new questions but answered none of the old ones. To this day, the identity of Jean Dubois and the source of his knowledge remain unknown. He never reappeared, never made another claim. The Dubois fortune was distributed as Henri's will specified, and Jean, whoever he was, faded into obscurity. The Sterling banking heir. In 1990, British banking executive Sir William Sterling died, leaving an estate estimated at $75 million. He had one son, Richard Sterling, who had emigrated to Canada in 1975 and had minimal contact with the family since then. The estate was prepared to transfer to Richard when an unusual complication emerged. Two different men appeared claiming to be Richard Sterling. The first appeared at the family solicitors in London with a Canadian passport and documentation. The second appeared at the Canadian consulate in Edinburgh 3 days later with equally convincing credentials. Both men looked approximately the right age, mid-40s. Both had similar physical features, though not identical. Both had documentation showing they were Richard Sterling, with bank accounts, employment records, and addresses in different Canadian cities. The estate's investigators interviewed both men separately. Both knew intimate details about the Sterling family that only Richard would know. The first man, whom investigators called Richard I, could describe Sir William's London residence room by room. He knew about family investments and business connections. He recounted childhood memories with convincing specificity. The second man, Richard II, had equally detailed knowledge but from different angles. He knew about family vacations, about Sir William's hobbies and habits, about relatives who had passed away years ago. He could recall conversations and incidents that matched the family's records. What made the case particularly strange was that neither man seemed to be aware of the other. They weren't working together. Each appeared genuinely shocked when informed another person was claiming the same identity. Investigators examined their backgrounds. Richard I had been living in Toronto since 1975, working in financial services. He had tax records, employment history, property records, all showing continuous residence in Canada since leaving Britain. Richard II had been living in Vancouver since 1976, with a similar paper trail showing continuous residence there. The timing was suspicious. The real Richard Sterling had left Britain in 1975. Both claimants appeared in Canada around that time, in different cities, both claiming to be Richard. It was as if Richard had somehow split into two people. The family tried to determine which was the real Richard. They brought in people who had known Richard before he left, former schoolmates, family friends, business associates. When shown photographs of both claimants, the witnesses were divided. Some recognized Richard I, some recognized Richard II, some couldn't decide. Even more bizarrely, when shown photographs of the real Richard from before 1975, both claimants looked somewhat similar to him, but neither was an exact match. It was as if both were approximations of what Richard might look like after 15 years in Canada. The case went to court in 1992. The proceedings were complicated by the fact that DNA testing for paternity was just becoming available but wasn't yet standard practice in inheritance cases. Both men agreed to DNA testing to prove their relationship to Sir William. The results were shocking. Neither man was biologically related to Sir William Sterling. Both were imposters. But this raised an even deeper mystery. How did both men have such detailed knowledge of the Sterling family? And why did both appear in Canada at the same time the real Richard emigrated there? Investigators developed a theory. Perhaps the real Richard Sterling had died shortly after arriving in Canada, possibly in an accident. Perhaps both of these men had encountered Richard, learned his story, and decided to assume his identity. But why would two different people do this independently? And how would both acquire such detailed family knowledge? The estate hired private investigators to search Canadian records for any trace of the real Richard Sterling after 1975. They found something disturbing. Immigration records showed Richard Sterling entering Canada in 1975, but there was no subsequent trace of him. No tax records, no employment, no address, nothing. It was as if he'd disappeared immediately upon arrival. One investigator proposed a darker theory. Perhaps Richard Sterling had died or been killed shortly after reaching Canada, and someone had assumed his identity. Then, years later, when that person died, another imposter took over the identity. This would explain the gap in records and the appearance of two different people claiming to be Richard, but this theory couldn't explain why two people would appear simultaneously to claim the inheritance, or how both acquired such intimate family knowledge. The court ultimately ruled that since neither claimant could prove biological relationship to Sir William, and since the real Richard Sterling couldn't be located, the estate would be distributed according to the will's alternative provisions, to distant relatives and charities. Both claimants disappeared after the ruling. Attempts to track them failed. The real fate of Richard Sterling remains unknown. Whether he's alive somewhere, living under a different identity, or whether he died decades ago and two imposters learned his story, has never been determined. The case remains one of the strangest in British inheritance law. Two men claiming the same identity, both with detailed knowledge, both proven to be imposters, yet no explanation for how they knew what they knew or what happened to the real heir. These 10 cases represent some of the most mysterious inheritance claims in history. From famous imposters who fooled families for decades to mysterious strangers with impossible knowledge, each case raises fundamental questions about identity, fraud, and the limits of what can be known. Some of these claimants were almost certainly fraudsters. Anna Anderson's DNA proved she wasn't Anastasia Romanova, and the Tichborne Claimant was likely Arthur Orton. The Sterling case proved both claimants were imposters. But even in these cases, the question remains, how did they know what they knew? Anna Anderson could describe Romanov family details that weren't published. The Tichborne Claimant knew intimate family secrets. Both Sterling imposters had detailed knowledge despite being unrelated. If they were fraudsters, someone with deep insider knowledge must have helped them. Yet no such person was ever identified. Other cases remain genuinely unsolved. The Dupont twins case defies explanation. Two identical men with equal claims to the same identity. the Mackenzie claimant who knew about buried treasure, Jean Dubois and his impossible knowledge of Henri's secret relationships. These cases exist in a gray area where the available evidence doesn't definitively prove imposture or legitimacy. The courts ruled based on legal standards of proof, but legal truth isn't always the same as actual truth. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is the precision of the knowledge these claimants possessed. These weren't vague claims or lucky guesses. They knew specific details, locations of hidden objects, private conversations, secret relationships, business dealings not in public records. The pattern across these cases suggests that inheritance fraud, when it occurs at this level of sophistication, involves knowledge that shouldn't be accessible, intimate, personal, undocumented knowledge that seems to come from living a life rather than studying it. Whether these were elaborate conspiracies involving insider help or something else entirely, they remind us that identity is more complex than documents and DNA. These cases show that what makes someone who they are, their knowledge, their memories, their connections, can somehow be possessed by people who shouldn't have access to it.